Tonight is a really very special night, and tonight, what makes it special? First of all, it's Yahrtzeit should be Yahrtzeit in terms of counting the Sphira. Yahrtzeit means the foundation. Yahrtzeit of the foundation. So we're really at what's called the bottom. Since Yahrtzeit should be Yahrtzeit is the foundation of the foundation. So that's a very important area of thinking in terms of, certainly Kabbalistically, the concept of Yahrtzeit should be Yahrtzeit. Also, what's tonight is the Yahrtzeit of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lutzato. He died in 1747. He was only basically 39 years old, and they once asked, there's a lot of ideas about him, but they once asked the Mizritcha Maggid, who was the Maggid who took over from the Baal Shem Tov, the whole Hasidus. So they once asked him why he died so young. He died in 1747 in Eretz Yisrael in Akko. That's where he lived for a short while. And he died in a plague, a cholera epidemic. And they once asked, like I said, the Mizritcha Maggid, why a person of such stature died. And the Mizritcha Maggid said that the world was not zoicha for more. So obviously, this is the Mizritcha Maggid who was, after the Baal Shem, he took over the whole Hasidus. And the second story I would, story I would like to say is the story that is brought down Reb Chaim Volozhin, who's the greatest Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. So a nephew of Reb Chaim Volozhin once wrote a letter to his uncle, Reb Chaim Volozhin, and he said to him that I just got finished reading or learning a sefer that was written by the Ramchal called the Adib Amorim, which is a sefer which is written on what's called the Idris that the Ramchal wrote. It's a Kabbalah sefer, really heavily laden with Kabbalistic thinking. So he told his uncle, Reb Chaim Volozhin, I just finished learning it and it's phenomenal stuff. Says, why was he not zoicha to live long? So Reb Chaim Volozhin told him, I will tell you, I don't know why. Only the Rebbe knows why these type of people don't make it and so on. But I will tell you what the Vilna Gaon, my Rebbe, who is obviously everybody knows the Vilna Gaon, what he said on the Ramchal. And here's what he said. There's a lot of ideas, but here's what he said. He said, when the Vilna Gaon was young and he started learning Kabbalah and so on, so it says that he wasn't sure if Reb Chaim Vital, who was the one who wrote down all the material of the Ari, he wasn't sure if Reb Chaim Vital understood what's called the nimshal of the Ari, because Kabbalah is a certain type of text. It's really code, but it has what's called a nimshal, an analog, what it really means. So he said when he finished, this is the Vilna Gaon talking, when he finished the sefer on Kabbalah and so on by the Reb Chaim Vital, he wasn't sure if Reb Chaim Vital, who was the greatest Talmud of the Ari, understood the true interpretation or analog of his Rebbe, the Ari. But then as he was learning further and further, he saw that Reb Chaim Vital did understand the real meaning of the Kabbalah of the Ari. Not just the metaphors, but what it really means. You see, so then the Vilna Gaon continues, and the Ramchal, and he mamash says, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lutzato clearly understood the nimshal of the Ari. Like with him, it wasn't even a doubt. And the Vilna Gaon ends by saying, Ubaruch Hashem, thank God, Gamani, so do I. That's what the Vilna Gaon said. So on the Ramchal, there was not even a question of his understanding. So this is the Vilna Gaon, who many people hold, probably, of course, that he was certainly as great as a Rishon. He's a phenomenal person, the Vilna Gaon. He's one of the most famous Jews, certainly of the last 1,000 years. And this is what he is saying about Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. So we can imagine what this person was, and so on. He's probably one of the greatest Kabbalists in the last 500 years. So obviously he was phenomenal. I mean, there's a great deal you can talk about the Ramchal in terms of his biography and so on. But I just want to bring down just some of those ideas about who this person was, which we really do not know. I mean, he died at 39 years old, so obviously if that's the case, it's just phenomenal. Imagine if he had lived another 50 years, how much more he would have written. And he wrote many, many Sfarim. Many of them are hidden. There's a whole story about why they're hidden and so on. But that's basically who Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was. And he was nifta in Yahrtzeit Sheb'i Yahrtzeit, which is tonight, on Chof Vav Iyar. Yeah, so before I continue, I want to just mention some names. First of all, this year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Benjamin Wolf, Ben Tzvi Hirsch, and Baruch ben Benjamin Wolf. They should have an Aliyah's Neshama. Also, I want to also wish to Rochel Bas Esther that she should have an easy time, that she should have tremendous health and nachas and simcha, and that everything should be well with her and with her future child. Also, a refuah shlema for Shol Chai Gavriel ben Sarah. He should also have a refuah shlema, and Sarah Bas Chana should have also a refuah shlema. And also refuah shlema for Elisheva Bas Leah and Doniel ben Luna. And I wish all the hatzlacha for all good simchas and good news for Rochel Bas Surah Bracha, for all kinds of simcha and good news. In any case, so the schus of the shiur should go for each one whatever they need. Okay. Anyway, that's who the Ramchal is. That's a small sample of the Ramchal himself, and so on, So what I wanted to do is just talk about these ideas, the concept of Yahrtzeit Sheb'i Yahrtzeit, to talk about, some of the ideas that Hashkafa and even Kabbalah talk about in this sphere. Now, we already know, I've mentioned many times, that what the Ramchal did is the Ramchal himself is so far removed from our reality that he needs an intermediary to create the reality. And he did. He created the concepts of forces. And these forces are known as spheres. And there are 10 of them. And I've mentioned them before, that they are divine, or they are called Elokus, because they represent the force or the instrumentation of the Ribono Shel Olam. We have no idea what they are, and so on, obviously, but they are in the same, if you want to use the same place or department as the Ribono Shel Olam. But even that's not true, because the Ribono Shel Olam himself is so far removed, even from the spheres, that God as an entity is beyond comprehension, and so on. But in any case, what they do is they create realities. So what the Ramchal does, and I mentioned this actually last week in terms of what Judaism really is, the whole concept of creating existential transformations, where you create existences and then you transform it into a higher one and then into a higher one and so on, until you get to the greatest existence of all, which is Olam Haba, which is the future world. So the way it's done is that the spheres create Olam Haba first. And in Kabbalah that is called Adam Kadmon, which is it's called primordial man. And Olam Haba is really an existential state, some type of existence that to us is incomprehensible. It's, from our standpoint, it's perfect. There's no negativity in any form, shape, or degree whatsoever in that place or that dimension. And who creates Olam Haba is the spheres. They create all the realities and so on. And the way they do it is they diminish their power. You want to call it light. In Kabbalah they use the concept called light, you see. So they diminish their energy or their light, and they create a lower reality, and then they diminish it further and create a lower reality and so on. So the key really, when you think about it, of what determines and creates realities are the spheres. And it all depends what their output is, you see. So what the Ramchal wants is he wants the Jews, because they're the ones who do it, to increase the output of the spheres, you see. So first he diminishes the power of the spheres, and that is a basic concept called Tzimtzum, which means to restrict or to diminish. And they diminish their output, you see, until they create the lowest reality, when you think about it, which is this world. And what he wants is the Jewish people to perform certain deeds, and these are basically the Taryag mitzvahs, 613 commandments, and they will to do these mitzvahs, and that will increase the output of the ore, of the force, of the energy of these spheres. And as that happens, then existence, or the realities or the dimensions, increases. Now we don't know what that means in terms of what does it mean for existence to increase. We don't know. But from even the after us, the reality that will be increased is Yemois HaMashiach. The Messianic era is an era that we cannot comprehend, even though it's physical and it's here. So, we would wonder, why can't we understand it? We won't. People do not understand what's about to happen. The reality of the Messianic era is beyond comprehension. I don't want to go into the whole idea, but I spoke about this, I think, last week and the week before, whatever, and so on. All the previous Shiurim. But then you go out of this world and you go into a higher reality, which is called the Olamas, the worlds of Olam Hazeh. And I mentioned previously there are 3 of them. So what's going to happen is the realities will be increased, made much greater, and we don't really comprehend what they are. And finally, the reality of Olam Haba, right? That reality will be created, which will be out of totally incomprehensible, and so on. I went very much into it in last week's Shiur, especially the Shiur in Lag BaOmer and the existential states, the 5 existential states of Judaism and so on. In any case, that's what he wants. So what God really wants is to increase the output of the energy or the ore of the spheres, and that will change reality. That's ultimately what he wants, and so on. And that's really, in many ways, the purpose of the creation, and ultimately man will be in that type of state where he will be as perfect as his type of being can ever be. In any case, that's an interesting concept. It's really very simple. First you go down, and then you go up. And that's how it's arranged, And the way to do it, of course, is called the mitzvahs. You see, there's Taryag mitzvahs, 613 commandments, and if you observe them, basically, you will reverse and make much greater the existential state of reality, until finally you come to a reality which is in many ways perfect, and that will be eternal. In any case, that's a very brief summary and so on, you see. So that's a first concept or idea which is very important. It's a general idea, but it's very, very important, you see. Now, how does that work in a certain sense? So the way it works is that these spheres create the neshama. Now we don't really know what the soul is. Nobody knows what their soul is, but that is the greatest creation and the first in many ways of the spheres themselves, you see. So that's a very important idea. Now, so the spheres create the neshama, but what's interesting is that, like I said, there are 10 spheres, and they are, which I think we're familiar with, the greatest of the spheres is Kessin. Then you have 9 below it, which is Chochma and Bina. Then you have Chesed and Gvura, Tferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, and Malchus. Those are the 10 spheres. But what is interesting, without getting into detail, is that those 10 spheres, which is called a partzuf. A partzuf is a configuration. It's like a set, you see. So those are the original 10 spheres, and that is a set or a configuration. But they have 613 divisions or sections. Yeah, that's what they have. 613 different sections. So what's interesting is when they create the neshama, then the neshama has 613 compartments, just like the spheres. Because in a certain sense they create not a replica, but certainly a model of them, and therefore the neshama has 613 parts to it, which in many ways is spectacular. Now, the neshama itself, right, emits or gives forth, actually it's the spheres, creates a body, you see. And the body has, according to Chazal, the rabbis, 613 parts. Each part corresponds to one of the 613 parts of the neshama, which corresponds to the 613 parts of the spheres. You see? So we're looking here at a very interesting parallel, you see. Now, what the Moshe then did, and this is in many ways how it works, he created 613 mitzvahs, commandments. So you have 613 parts in the spheres, which correspond to 613 parts of the neshama, and each neshama has its own 10 spheres with its 613 parts. So you have the spheres of 613 parts, then you have the neshama of 613 parts, which brings forth the body itself, which has 613 parts, you see. Now, the idea is for the neshama that is encapsulated in the body to increase the ore, you see, the light or the energy of its corresponding 613 parts in its 10 spheres, because each neshama has its own 10 spheres, without getting it to becoming too more technical. So, what the Moshe did is very interesting. There are 613 parts of the body, as the Gemara says, right? There's 248 organs, and there's 365, sometimes they translate them as muscles, as sinews, whatever it is, but it's 248 plus 365 comes out to 613. So what the Moshe did is he gave the individual, basically the Jewish person, right, 613 commandments, And each commandment is connected to one of the 613 parts of the body. So when a person does a mitzvah, what will happen is the aspect of the sphere, which corresponds to the 613th part in the body, will be incredibly energized, you see, and ultimately that energy will be stored for that body part at Tchias HaMesim. So it comes out that the way a person is resurrected in Tchias HaMesim is if he did the Taryag mitzvahs, 613 mitzvahs, which energized his set of the 10 spheres, you see. So he'll get up with all 613 parts of his body, basically, you know. Now, if you're wondering, well, how did I get up? How do I get up? I don't do all the mitzvahs. Why? I'm not a kohen. If I'm not a kohen, I don't have the mitzvahs of the kahuna, right? There are many mitzvahs. I think now there's about close to 250 or whatever mitzvahs that we practice today. The rest, they're not even applicable today. And not only that, even when all the mitzvahs were applicable, right? It depends who you were. If you were a kohen gadol, a levi, right? Each one has his mitzvahs that only he does, right? His tribe, and not the other tribe. So the answer is that, you know, there are different answers, but a person can come back as a kohen, as a levi, Yisrael. So in all the Gilgulim, in all the reincarnations, you know, hopefully he will have done all the 613 mitzvahs that will mechayeh, which means resurrect, his total body. You know, I mean, obviously there are a lot of details and complications and so on, you know. Now the problem is, as an agav, it means as an incidental, is that certain mitzvahs correspond to the heart, you know, and then mitzvahs that correspond, let's say, to the spleen. So if you don't do the mitzvah that corresponds to the spleen, you'll survive. You don't do the mitzvah that corresponds to your heart, bad news, you're dead. Because the heart is an organ that is essential, like the brain, etc. You know, so how the Rebbe will deal with that is his business, basically. You see, but essentially, ideally, I should say, you should do all the 613 or whatever's commanded to you, and that's how you get up. That's what's mechaya. That's what gives you the future life of the guf. So it comes out that the mitzvah is the trigger for an or that corresponds to each part in the spheres. That's basically what it is. So you have these four parallels. 613 in the spheres, 613 in the neshama, 613 in the guf, in the body, and 613 mitzvahs. And they all parallel each other. Very interesting concept, which in many ways is very important. And anyway, now, so that's very interesting. Now, so far, this is what existed. So far, this is what existed, where you could increase the output of the light, the ore of the spheres, thereby enormously giving power to the entire body. But something changed. What changed? And that was the sin of Adam. What exactly happened by the sin of Adam? What happened is that because of the sin of Adam, there was created a new reality. I shouldn't say created a new reality, but there was a new reality that became part of the formula, or part of the cheshbon, as they say. What was that? And what was created was something that never was. Until now, what you could do is increase the output of the spheres, like I said, with the Taryag mitzvahs. That's how you would do that, and that would ensure that you would survive in Olam Haba. That would make sure that you had Tchias HaMesim and so on. So that's very important. But you really could not block that light. In other words, you could increase the output. You see, you couldn't diminish the output, but you could increase. If you didn't do the mitzvah, so you wouldn't increase. But that's where it was at. So it either remained the light of the spheres, or you could increase it by doing the Taryag mitzvahs. But if once the spheres gave their output, their light, right, you couldn't block it. There was no way. So Adam changed that by his sin. What happened is there was a Nachash, a snake, and he was really the mouthpiece of the Satan. You see, and what his job, what he tried to do, was to get Adam and Chava to sin, which means to rebel, to go against the command of God. And the command was then, obviously, not to eat from a certain type of tree, you see. And they, of course, failed to do that. So the original job was to ignore the advice of the snake, called the primordial snake, or to ignore the advice of the Satan, because the snake was really the mouthpiece of the Satan. Just ignore it. Had you done that, then Adam would have increased, because that one mitzvah, you didn't need Taryag. There was no such thing as 613 commandments, because all of them was wrapped up in that one mitzvah. To empower 613 mitzvahs, all you need to do was that one mitzvah. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Somehow the Rebbe wired all of the 613 parts of the spheres into that one mitzvah. That's all he had, was that one mitzvah. If he did it, then that would have enormously increased the output of the neshama of Adam, which was his 10 spheres, right? But he had a massive amount of spheres. His spheres were just incredibly huge, you see? And that one mitzvah would have done it. But he failed. So therefore, he changed reality. How? Because he introduced a concept called Zohama. And I mentioned last week that there is an existence called physical existence, but it is now intermingled with Zohama, which is the world of Satan. Before that, it was the world of pure physicality. Geshem, I mentioned this last week. And that's all there was. So Adam Rishon, first man, was pure physicality, of which we do not know what it was. He was not like us, or rather I should say we were not like him. I gave a comparison which I think is a really very good mashal. Even in the physical world, there are two fundamentally different types of physical substances. One is energy. Energy is physical, even though it's energy. We don't know what it is, but it's part of the physical world. Like radio wave is physical, can be detected by physical instruments. We have no idea what it is that goes through the ear, yet it's a physical reality. And then, of course, besides radio waves or energy, there's matter. Matter, we know, according to Einstein, is a frozen form of energy. Of course, we don't know what that means really, but we do know that they're both physical realities. Therefore, you could say the same thing. Before the sin of Adam, Adam was like a body of pure energy, which we don't know what that is, but it had no matter, you see. Then after the sin, right, then Adam became matter. Very interesting parallels, you see. Why? Because Adam introduced the concept of Zohama, of the Satan. Now, Zohama, what is Zohama? Zohama is what's called a pollution. It's a contamination. It's really a force that is emitted by the Satan, you see. And what he did is by giving belief to the Satan, he allowed the Satan to intermingle with the world of physicality, his world, and then all of a sudden the world changed. It now became a world of physicality plus Zohama, because we now, if you want to use the word, fell into the world of the Satan, which is a material world, right? Not a world of energy, you see. So that's bad news, you see, because we now became subject to the force of the Satan, and that force is called Zohama, you see. Zohama is a force that the Satan uses. It's a projected force that he can do all kinds of things. Now, But the interesting thing about it is this. I once gave an example, which I think is a very good example, that even in this physical world, right, scientists have proven, I think in 2012, that in order for energy to be turned into matter, which everybody holds, that's Einstein, and so on, you need what's called the Higgs boson. And that boson, that particle, whatever it is, it's called the Higgs field, can actually change energy into matter, substance. Right. Without that Higgs boson, it remains pure energy. You can almost look at it that's exactly what happened by the Mauritian. Before that, he was pure energy. Then he introduced the Zohama, and the equivalent of the Zohama is the Higgs boson, which now turns his energy field, whoever he was, into physical substance, into matter, you see, which is very interesting. In any case, this is what Adam did. He introduced his world, which is pure physicality, an incredibly fine level of physicality, like I mentioned, and he now became intermingled with matter, okay, because of Zohama, you see, which is bad news. Now, what does that mean? Because what the Zohama does is several ideas. The first idea is that Zohama blocks the aura of the spheres. Never happened before. The aura of the spheres was continuous. You could increase it, like I said, by the mitzvahs, depending on what you're commanded to do. But you could increase the aura. You couldn't diminish it, right? And you couldn't block it, but you could increase it. That's great, which is what Adam could do. The problem is, after Adam fell into the world of the Zohama, or the world of Satan, right? The Zohama, that pollution, can block the aura of the spheres. You see, first time, never happened before. And that is bad news. But wait a minute. If you block the aura of spheres, right, you're blocking the aura of what? Of the spheres of any person. So if a person does an Avera, then whatever Avera he did blocks the aura of the sphere that corresponds to that Avera. Because just like there are 613 mitzvahs, each one is 613 Averas. The reverse is the Avera. So for the first time, could you imagine? You can block the aura of whatever that Avera corresponds to, which mitzvah, and where in the spheres it is. You see? Never happened before. So therefore, man, if he blocks his particular set of 10 spheres, right, can become severely injured and die. Because his spheres, which gives him chiyus, life, right, without that, he's dead. Because he needs the spheres to constantly maintain who he is. You see? It's incredible, the repercussions. That is the origin of death and the origin of all diseases. Very interesting. That's where it comes from. That's why before Adam's sin, he could live forever. He couldn't get a disease, you see, because you couldn't block the spheres of whatever part of the body he had. Because remember, each one corresponds to some area of the body. He couldn't block it, right? So why would he die, right? He wouldn't die, he wouldn't get any disease. But once you introduce the Zohama of the Satan, and the world now became a combination of Geshem, physicality, and Zohama, or Satan, right? You now could block the light of the spheres. So that was the first devastation. So he now became subject to death. And that's what the Bansham told him. On the day that you eat it, you will die. Because you will now have the ability, since you mingled now with another existence, you now have the ability to block, right, the sphere, the light or the energy of that sphere that corresponds to your sin. You see? And guess what? The body part that now corresponds to that sin is going to what? Is going to wilt and die. This is true medicine. You see? This is what a Kabbalistic doctor would do. That's how he cures disease. It's a whole different it's a whole different paradigm of what a disease is. Just like they discovered nobody knew what disease was. They thought it was all kinds of fluids, air, fire, water, whatever, and then they realized it's pathogens. It's either viruses. In fact, the word virus is averos, sins. It's funny that they picked that word for virus. Avira, right? An avera is a sin, right? So that's infectious diseases. Or it's what's called degenerative, like cancer, heart attack. It's one of those two, where the body ceases to function because it's not functioning correctly, and so on. But that can only come, so that was the second paradigm, that it's not the ancient way of looking at it, where you're not having enough fluids or whatever, the bile, whatever these guys thought up, Finally, they understood the theory of germs, Louis Pasteur, right? But the real origin of disease is none of that. It's the avera. Of course, anybody listening to this shiur would say, what kind of witchcraft is this? What kind of witch doctor are we talking about? Were they going to sing about, the incantations and all that? No, that's really what goes on. Our problem is we don't have any clue as to which spheres are connected to which averas, right? And which organ is connected to which averas. We don't know. You see, you have to be a very great makubal, Kabbalist, to know that. And there were people who knew that. And they would tell you, you got this disease. Wait a minute. You got high sugar. You got diabetes. So this is the avera that lies on your neshama that is blocking this particular aspect of the sphera. So therefore what you have to do is do tshuva on that avera, right? And then do the mitzvah. And guess what? Your diabetes will disappear. You see? The problem is nobody really knows what's connected to what. You see? I don't think the AMA will ever certify this kind of doctor. But I'm telling you what the real origin of disease is. Once you understand the origin of the whole structure of a human and how it connects to the spheres and the mitzvahs and so on, then you know exactly what is going on, you see. But in any case, so this is a very, very important, obviously. It's a fundamental aspect of the human being and what he is, you see. But that's what you really, in order to do that, you really have to know, you see. So, but what's also interesting is not only Adam Harishon by his sin now blocked the aura of the spheres, and since the sphera was connected to that mitzvah, right, and was being blocked by the Zohama that he created, right, it blocked it, and all of a sudden he became physical, really physical, the way we are, and therefore he was subject to death. That's number one. The second problem, which never happened before, you see, is that it's not only that the Zohama of the Satan, of that world, it's called the Klipa, the Tumah, could block the sphera, you see, and therefore block the area of the neshama, which would automatically block the area of the body and subject it to vulnerability of all kinds of deficiencies, which is called disease, right? The Satan can be yoinek from the kedusha of that sphera. See, this was the second blow that Adam did. So it's not only that he blocked the sphera, no. The Satan can now divert the aura of the sphera from the neshama, which would block it from the guf, and actually turn it to himself. So he himself can enliven or invigorate himself and grow in might. That's a second tragedy that happened. It's called the Yanika, where the Satan is able to yoinek. The Satan is able to nourish from the sphera, right, the area of the sin that this person would have gotten had he done the mitzvah. Instead he sinned, blocked that light, and that light or energy now goes to the Satan that energizes him, and therefore he grows. And that you begin to see, right, the destruction of the world itself Because once the Satan gets a hold of that ore, then he can wreak havoc with the entire planet. And that is really why the world looks the way it does. And boy, does it look bad pretty now. Now it looks terrible. So therefore, this is the world of Zohama, where the light of a sphere on any particular person or on the world is blocked. Now, part of the problem is, like I mentioned in the Shiur of Avos Yisrael, we're all one organism. So if you block the sphere of one Jew, guess what? Since we're all part of one organism, guess what? We get blocked also, even though we didn't do the Avera. You see, that's the concept where one Jew sins, it will affect every Jew, because we're all one organism. And also what it is that if we do one mitzvah, then every Jew will get the increase of the aura of the spheres. You see? So we're all tied together in that sense, which is what I mentioned. And I mentioned the metaphor. We are Siamese twins, right? One body, many heads. That's all it is, but we're really one organism. But the secret is the ability of the Zohama, of the Satan in that world, since it's now connected to the Geshem, pure Geshem world, can block and divert the aura of the spheres. Very, very important idea, you see. Now, what did Adam do? You see, that's the concept here, you see. Well, like I said, Adam sinned, but the problem was his sin wasn't a little sin. Since he was connected to one Taryag mitzvah, basically, therefore he could release the aura of the totality of all the spheres, not just but the 10 of the entire Bria, because the spheres are many, many different levels. There's 10, and each one has 10, and each one of them has 10, and so on, into an infinite breakdown. So what happened was, his sin was fundamental, and his sin was all-comprehensive. It was devastating to the whole creation. So it wasn't him that had to die, it was every single organism, living thing had to die, because he was everything. That's what Adam HaRishon was. So that had very interesting manifestations. And now you begin to see, wait a minute, if he blocked the ore of those spheres of him, which was the totality of everything, the entire creation, then he damaged his foundation, his Yahrtzeit, you see? And now we begin to understand what happened in a beautiful way and what the Rabbi did as a result of that. You see? Now, what we have to know is that the human body is a model. It is a model of the 10 spheres, you see. But it has two different areas. The 10 spheres are represented in his head, okay? And they're also represented in his body. That's why we are shaped like this, with a head, a torso, legs, and a genital region. That's why we are shaped the way we are, because the spheres are arranged in that form, from top to bottom. Okay, it's called linear, you see. So let's take a look. Begin to understand some beautiful ideas that emerge once you see this model, you see. Now, the normal way they do is they look at the 10 spheres that the body represents these 10 spheres, because we are a model. We are a model, our configuration, our stature, the way we stand, exactly like the 10 spheres, from top to bottom. Therefore, if you think about it, how does it work? Well, you have Kessin, Chochmah, and Bina, which are the top 3. Those are the main spheres that energize the lower 7, right? So you have Kessin, Chochmah, and Bina. They are represented by the brain. There are 3 brains for those people who don't know. There are 3 of them, right? If I recall correctly, there's the cerebrum, and the medulla oblongata. I hope I'm right? It's been a long time since I looked at my anatomy. Anyway, those 3 brains they rule the entire body. You see, that's Kessin, Chochma, and Bina. Okay? They rule the entire body. Then you have the right hand is Chesed, the left hand is Gvura. Okay? The torso is Tiferes. Fine. Then you have the right leg is Netzach, the left leg is Hoid, and the genital region is Yesoid and Malchus. Okay, and that's how Kabbalah looks at it, you see. And the male and female have obviously two different types of genitals, and therefore the two concepts, Yesoid and Malchus, are represented by each one, but in obviously different organs and so on, you see. And that's a very important concept, by the way, which I will explain, because that shows you what really happened, and so on. In any case, so that's the 10 spheres of the body itself. But the head has 10 spheres also. Okay, what do we have, right? We have the same idea, Keseh, Chochma, Bina, with the 3 brains. Then we have the right ear and the left ear. We have the nose, right? And then we have the mouth and the tongue. Those are the 10 spheres in the head, you see. Also very important. Now let's take a look at what Adam did. What Adam did is the basic sin, right, that Adam did is he believed his wife. The Satan spoke in one conversation, Lashon Hara, Rechilus, and Meitzah Shemra, all 3 in one conversation. He spoke Lashon Hara, right, because he degraded God by saying that God, the reason why God told you not to eat is because he doesn't want any rivals, because the tree, he got his power from the tree, is what Rashi says, and he doesn't want any rivals, so that's why he didn't want you to eat. That's Lashon Hara. That's degrading God. Obviously, God created everything. The second thing, right, is he said to Adam, the reason why God doesn't want you to eat from that tree, not because he wants to do something good for you, on the contrary, he doesn't want you, right, to rival him. So that would create a sinner, a hatred in who? In Adam Harishon. That's what God is. He's selfish. And that's what Rechilus is, where you say something that will create hatred in the listener from the subject of the conversation. And then the whole thing was false. That's Meitzah Shemra. So the Satan's main Avera was Lashon Hara, Rechilus, and Meitzah Shemra. It's amazing. That was the sin. Now, Chava listened and she believed it, and she went over toward Adam and told him, and he believed her. And you're not allowed to believe Lashon Hara, certainly Rechilus, certainly Meitzah Shemra. So all of them committed the sin of Lashon Hara. You see, but since Lashon Hara is done with the mouth and the tongue, you see, so automatically, which is Lashon Hara and so on, right? Automatically that Adam and Chava damaged the sphera that is represented by the mouth and the tongue, which is Yesoid and Malchus. Now Yesoid is the 9th sphera, and that pours its energy into the 10th sphera called Malchus. And Malchus is the receptacle of all energy of the upper 9, because Yesoid is 9, Malchus is 10, the bottom. 10 does not give forth its energy because there's nothing below it. It receives the energy and forms a reality. The problem is that Lashon Hara, which is done with the tongue and the mouth, which is what they spoke, damages the 9th and 10th sphera. So the 9th sphera, which is Yesoid, right, which pours its energy into the Malchus, which is the 10th, cannot work. Doesn't work. You see? So therefore Lashon Hara became the real sin of what Adam did. He damaged his Yesoid and his Malchus. Very interesting. But wait a minute. We now know that if that's the case, automatically, if he stops that energy of those two spheres, Yesod Malchus, right? So automatically his body will be affected. Because I said, the corresponding Avera of Yesod and Malchus, which is his tongue and his mouth, which was damaged by his sin, automatically will damage the area of the body that those spheres maintain. And what is that? That's the genital region. That's what it is, which is what I said. Therefore, both the man and the woman suffered in the genital region. It's astounding. That's what happens. So, in terms of the the Gemara says that Adam was born circumcised. Nothing, because there's no blockage, there's no diversion. You see? So that area of his body which represents the genital region, the Yesod Malchus, is fine. But after the damage he did with his mouth, right, by believing the Lashon Hara, he damaged the mouth, right, which is the organ of communications. Therefore, Adam grew a foreskin over the genital region. There you go, Milah. So you have to have circumcision. That's how it happened. Adam was born without a need for circumcision. You see, very interesting. The reason why he had to have is the Gemara says he actually grew a foreskin that would required to cut. That's the whole concept of a bris. You see? So what I'm saying is exactly what happened to Adam Rishon, the necessity for a bris, because that he grew the foreskin, and that foreskin is the representation of the orla, which is the foreskin. That is the blockage, exactly, of the Zohama. You see, a woman, she had the same suffering. What was that? So she has an area in the genital region, same thing, right, of Yesod Malchus, right? But the major area is the uterus. That's her Yesod, and so on. And all of a sudden, she became a Nida, right? Since you destroyed life, guess what? The lining of your uterus will be destroyed once a month. You see how it works? Because she destroyed, right, the flow from her spheres of Yesod into Malchus, which basically represents her genital region of the lining of the uterus. That's the concept of menstruation. Why? Because the lining of the uterus represents life. Without that, you're not having a kid. And that was destroyed. So once a month, she must experience death, which is what she introduced into the world by spreading the Lashon Hara, or what the Satan told her. You see? So now what happens? It's very interesting once you understand how this works. So the Rebbe Hashem now commands the Jewish people, right? So what's the first thing he commands to Avraham Avinu? You need a bris that will remove that area, right, that represents the Ola because of the sin of Adam, because that's the job of the Jew, to restore the flow from Yesod, which is the ninth sphere, into Malchus. That's what the job of a Jew is, believe it or not. So in order to indicate the Jew that that's what he has to do, therefore every Jewish male has to have a bris, circumcision. You see? It's fascinating. That's what it is. Because the major job of the Jew is to undo the damage of Adam Rishon, which is he damaged Yesod, the ninth sphere, flowing into the 10th. There you are. And therefore, right, he has, so to symbolize that that's what his job is, right, every Jewish child, male, has to have a circumcision, because that's his job. And what is interesting is the word for foreskin is called Ola, right? And what was the sin that created the Ola, right, that covers, right, the whole area that represents Yesod Malchus? Lashon Hara. So the word Ola, if you think about it, is Lamed, the letter Lamed, Hey Resh Ayin, Lamed Hara, Lashon Hara. The word Ola itself can be seen to be Lashon Hara. The word itself spells it out. You see? That is why we now begin to understand something incredible. Why is Lashon Hara so bad? Because it damages because since it's done with the mouth and the tongue, which represents in the head, right? Kabbalistically, Yesoid Malchus, the 9th and 10th Sphira, and the Yesoid, which is the 9th Sphira, has to pour into the 10th, or else there's no reality. That's why it's so bad, you see? It's a very, very profound concept. And it's funny because the Ramchal actually says this, in the Sefer Tikkunim Chadoshim. He actually brings this down, which is, I remember when I first saw this, I was astounded, because this is the real Kabbalistic understanding of what's going on. You see? And it explains also things of the bris. Why that organ, right? Why the 8th day? Because the job of the Jew is to remove the Ola, you see, which is the Zohama. The Ola is the Zohama, you see, is to remove that. That's the job of the Jew, and to restore the creation where Yesoid, the sphere of Yesoid, pours into Malchus, you see. So he removes the physical symbol of the Zohama, which is the Ola, which was caused by Lashon Hara, you see, and as a result of that, he corrects the damage done by Adam Rishon. And when is that damage really done? Ultimately, on the 8,000th year, right? Because we have this world, the age of the Tikkunim, and then you have the Messianic era, but the world ends in the year 6,000, and then it goes from 6 to 7 is what's called a Zikuch, existential transformation of one Kabbalistic domain. Then from 7 to 8, right? But the real Zikuch, the real beginning of the end of physicality, Zohama ends in the Messianic era because the Sultan is killed. But the physical world begins to change, the world of Geshem without Zohama, but Geshem now becomes spiritual, you see, in the beginning of the 8,000th year. And guess what? That's the 8th day. That's why a bris has to be done in that place on the 8th day. And that is the symbol that every Jew carries with him, basically, you see, to indicate that he has to undo the chet of Adam Rishon, you see. And this is really the understanding. You now have an understanding of what a bris really is, Kabbalistically. And the whole setup of the concept of the vulnerability of all of this. And you also understand the idea of what Lashon Hara, why it is so bad, and so on. You see. Now I wanted to also bring out a very interesting observation. You see, disease comes in two forms. One is called, degenerative. Cancer, heart attacks, strokes, diabetes. This is a failure of the body, basically, within its own systems. So that's one type of disease. Then there's what's called infectious diseases, which is brought about by viruses, fungi, bacteria, and so on. There are two types of diseases. Why would one get one? Some people get cancer, right? Some people get tuberculosis. What determines that? You see what I'm saying? It's a very interesting concept. All of this is predetermined. Nothing is by accident, which one you get. So the fact that you get it, we already know. Because somewhere in your diary, you did a sin, and you blocked and diverted the energy of that particular sin in that particular avera, so it's blocked. And therefore, the body part that corresponds to that is damaged. So therefore, it becomes vulnerable to bacteria. That's how they get in. Or other than that, they can't, you see. But it's interesting to look at these two different types of diseases, you see. Now, what is interesting, we know what an infectious disease is. For most of mankind's history, most people died from infections, not from degenerative. I mean, they probably were always around, there's no question about that. But the main thing that were the killer diseases, tuberculosis, typhus, typhoid, all these infectious, pathogens and so on. And then we now, in this generation, the last 130 years, most people are dying not from infections. A lot of that has been cured because of the antibodies, the antibiotics and so on. Most people die today from degenerative diseases, right? Heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, cancer, fatty liver. I mean, you can go down the whole host and so on, The question is, what determines if a person will suffer from infectious, and what determines if a person will suffer from degenerative? Now, it's very hard to say, obviously. Only God knows which one, if a person's going to be hit. I relate it to the whole structure of man. But it's interesting. I believe I have a certain understanding, which I'd like to share with you, When a person sins, there's two things, or rather there's what's called the essential feature of the sin. One feature is sovereignty. When you sin, you're going against the sovereignty of God. God says, don't do this, and you do it. So you've defied his sovereignty. You're not doing what he ordered, right? So I believe, therefore, that will lead, although we don't know when and how, because God takes into account not only the sin of what you do now, he looks back through all your incarnations, and he says, okay, and I got to pay back. You lived 600 years ago, and this has never been paid back. I got to undo what you did 600 years ago. So, only God has the view of the totality of your existence. So he can order when and where and how and so on. But I believe that the infectious diseases will hit basically based on sovereignty. You violated his sovereignty. You rebelled. He said, don't do this, and you did it. So he gets his guards, the viruses, right? He gets these guys to go after you. You see? I mean, these are the instruments of God, but you think about that. So therefore, that person will be hit with an infectious diseases. But if you think about it, today, people don't die from infectious diseases, basically. I mean, there are people, obviously, who do, but the real killer of mankind today is degradation, right? Degenerative, where the body's not making it because it's being mistreated and so on. Whether because of too much sugar, too much insulin, right? Or cancer. Now, cancer, which is a very interesting disease, I'd like to explain something which is very interesting. And I believe that it has its own unique form of a virus, although we cannot always match it, because only God can match. We don't know the real history of anybody, really, Cancer is a very interesting disease. It's when a cell in the body decides to go amok. You see, in two ways. That's what a cancer is. The unique idea of cancer is that, and people don't really know why, cancer can hit any form of life, basically. Anyone. Animals get cancer. Humans get cancer. Probably the only thing that doesn't get cancer is cancer. You see? So people wonder, or scientists wonder, how does cancer hit everything? And the second thing, cancer can hit any organ in the body, anyone. That's why there are hundreds and hundreds of different cancers, because any organ can be subject to cancer. What is cancer really, if you think about it? So one of the very important theories, is this. If you think about it, every cell in an organism, right, has to make a decision. Either it is a singular organism, cell, it's a one-celled idea, right? So you have one-celled animals, right? You have the protozoa, you have the paramecium, I remember those things, right? And so on, They're one-celled organisms. They have to do everything by themselves, everything. right? Digest, excrete, reproduce, you name it, they got to do it, right? Because they have nobody else to help them do all the functions that they have to do to live. They're called single cell or unit. They're single units organisms. Very interesting. But most organisms are multicellular. Think about that, right? They don't have one cell. They have specialization. There are cells devoted to reproduction, cells devoted to digestion, cells devoted to pumping or whatever. There are trillions of cells devoted to different functions. That's called a collective. You see? So as such, what's interesting is every cell, what are you working for? You working for yourself, or are you working for the collective? Every cell in the human body basically is working for the collective. What does that mean? That means if all of a sudden the cell is not working right, for whatever reason, right, then the body somehow tells the cell, I'm sorry, but you got to drop dead. You got to commit suicide. That's called apoptosis. It's a real thing, a real function. That means the cell has to give up on its life, and it commits suicide. Literally, because the cell is not working for itself, right? It's working for the collective, for the organism. You see, every cell in the human body is working for the organism. And therefore, apoptosis, that's what it's called, right, is a true, property of every cell. You see? So, in many ways, and nobody knows how, cells have learned how to give up. They work for the body. They don't work for themselves. So if they're asked by the brain or whatever the device is that communicates, I'm sorry, but you're harming us, you got to go. That cell commits suicide in whatever form. There's a whole way they do that. I mean, well, how the body does that is beyond belief and so on, you know. But the key concept I want to illustrate is that cell has to make a decision. Either I tell the collective to jump in the lake, right? So I'm not going to commit suicide. You know where you can go, right? Or the cell says, okay, and the cell goes and commits suicide. Therefore, every cell in the human body has the potential to become singular. It can rebel. Interesting. Where it can tell the rest of the body, you know all where you can all go. You see, that's what a cancer cell is. All of a sudden, it takes from every other cell. It steals, and that's how a person dies. He starves to death. You see, a cancer cell is a cell that used to be part of the collective, and now has become a rebel, singular. So it does two things. It takes whatever it can get, and it couldn't care less about any other cell. It robs and steals all the nutrients, so a person ultimately starves to death. And the second thing is it reproduces endlessly. It doesn't stop. It's immortal, which is astounding. Somehow cancer cells have evaded mortality, or I should say immortality, or mortality, right? You see, that's the classic concept. So they reproduce on and on and on. You see, it's like a paramecium. It can reproduce, as far as I know, over and over and over. It doesn't stop. In a certain sense, it's immortal, right? There was a very famous woman who died in the 50s, and they still have her cells, cancer cells, reproducing thousands of times. Henrietta Lacks or something, I think that's her name, so on. Very famous woman. She died, she had uterine cancer, and she allowed whatever the case was and so on, you know. So they took her cancer cells, and they cultured it, and that's been growing for the last 75 years. I mean, anybody who's into biology knows this, and so on, you know. Because cancer cells are immortal, because they have defied the collective, you see. What causes cancer? Well, I mean, basically, it's an abuse of the cell, where the cell says, I gotta stop this nonsense. I'm being abused all the time, or I'm being mutated, you know. I'm getting out of the collective, right, and I'm becoming singular. Bingo, you cancer, you see? So you have to hope the cell is benign where it won't make colonies. But if it's malignant, then it makes colonies. Whatever it is, but the essential concept of a cancer cell is that it rebels against the collective, becomes a singular unit, and destroys the human body. So everybody's trying to figure out, and that's why it can appear in any cell in the body and in any organism, because every cell has the potential to rebel. Very interesting concept, you see. But I've thought about it, and I feel that a cancer cell, how does it originate? I mean, it has the physical originations and so on, It's because for whatever sin you've done, which prevents the ore of that sphera, right, from energizing this particular organ where the cancer will grow, is not a sin of rebellion. It's a sin of denial. Because that's what a cancer cell does. It denies the organism. It says, I'm not interested. I will exist on my own. So I feel in some way, and we don't know really how, that the origin of a cancer cell is really a denial of the collective, you see. And that means that the sin that the person did, even though we don't understand, we don't see it many times, because a person can say, hey, I never denied the existence of God. Maybe, but maybe it's a previous Gilgul. We have no idea. But that cancer arises from a denial of God's existence. It becomes singular. Hey, don't bother me. I'm not interested in being part of the collective of creation. You see? So therefore, he blocks whatever the sphere is in that particular organ, and he will therefore develop a disease that could be the disease of that particular sin. Now, you can't diagnose based on that, obviously, but I believe that's why you have two different types of sins. Well, what have we covered? Interesting ideas. You see? You now know the origin based on the structure of a human, based on the structure of the 10 spheres, and the neshama, and the body, and the taryag, 613 commandments. It's not an accident, right? Every one corresponds to some aspect of the physical body. And we see that exactly what happened by Adam Arishon. The exact parts of his body, by Adam and Chava, that represent, right, Yesoid and Malchus, which is the sin of Lashon Hara, which is what they did. That is the real sin, right? The parts of their body that represent Lashon Hara, right, was affected in their body. It's not an accident. And therefore God said, I'm sorry, your job is to correct the sin of Adam Arishon. And if that's the case, right, the man needs a bris. But what does a woman need? So the woman's tikkun isn't the bris, obviously, but what it is the mitzvah of hadlaka. A woman has to light candles. Since you extinguished the light of the world, you need to light the candle of Shabbos, because Shabbos is the entry of Malchus. That is the entry of the sphere of Malchus. For that you need a Shiur on Shabbos. But it's the Shiur of the Shabbos Malchusah, that's really what it is. So therefore, a woman lights candles to introduce the light of Malchus. So apparently, since she did that mitzvah, that's the tikkun for her damage. You see? And that's candle. And the second mitzvah is challah. She does challah, and challah, the bread, is always symbolized as the essential ingredient of the world. You see? So challah takes challah, which is the chelik of the dough that represents Adam Harishon. So when you give challah, right, so that represents what you call rejuvenating the neshama of Adam, and it's also Chava, so that's a tikkun for her. You see, so it's interesting, both people have to have a tikkun for the whole idea. But since man, his tikkun is basically larger than a woman's, obviously, because he has all the mitzvahs, and a woman only has mitzvahs that are only part, if there's man grama, if the time demands it, they're pata, you see, and a man is chayav all taryag, therefore he's a major representative. But in any case, that you now understand the logic of what a bris is, what a hadlok is, why a woman becomes menstruant. Why then? It makes no sense. Why does the uterus have to shed its lining every month? What kind of logic is that? You get it, you keep it, and that's it. You don't have to shed it, and then there's bleeding and all that, you see? And the same thing with the man and so on. And why does the Torah command, then and so on, But in any case, I've tried to explain the concept of Yesod should be Yesod, and that's what Adam Rishon damaged, the foundation of the foundation, because he damaged the tongue and the mouth, which is what he did, believe Lashon Hara, and so on. Therefore, since you damaged it, that is the damage of Yesod, the foundation of the foundation, which is what he basically did. And therefore, the Ramchal, he dies on the day of Yesod Sheb Yesod, which is basically now, right? And because that was his life's work, to teach these concepts, what's called the Or Pnimi, I talked about last week. You see, that's what he did. That was his life's work, to increase the knowledge of the internal structure of the Torah. And when you do that, you certainly increase the beauty of the Torah, because it's incredible how everything now fits, you see. So maybe someday, there will come a day, when someday there's no more doctors, there's no AMA, right? There's none of this stuff. You go to your local rabbi, or you don't even need a rabbi, because each Jew will become a prophet, be able to communicate with God. And you're going to say to God, well, which Avera do I have to rectify? You see? Because that's blocking the sphere of that particular. And God will say, okay, this is the mitzvah, and bamo. So all of us will be certified as Kabbalistic doctors, you see? And therefore, you have a whole different understanding of what is going on. But what's even better is, therefore, you are going to do mitzvahs, which will increase the sphera of that particular organ. You see? Could you imagine? You get tired, no energy, so you ask, which sphera will increase the organ of whatever gives me energy? The brain, the heart, whatever, right? And instead of having to do exercise, push-ups, right? You increase the ore of that sphera, and you get up in the morning and you jump out of bed and you run around the block 18 times, right? Because you know which sphera to activate. And that's the beauty of knowing what turns you on, you see? And so that's the concept of Yesod should be Yesod, and I hope that this Shiur will benefit all the people that I mentioned, and hopefully this Yesod should be Yesod, which Ramchal was so busy with his life, will surely bring the Mashiach. And we know, to end, what is the basic function of the Mashiach ben Yosef? Yesod should be Yesod. Because the one who represents Yesod among these 10 spheres, guess what? Is Yosef HaTzadik. That's the inyan of the Mashiach ben Yosef, to restore the flow of Yesod, the sphera, which is like opening up a faucet. That's the Yesod, and it flows into the vessel, right, into the basin. That's Malchus. That's the job of Mashiach ben Yosef, you see. And the one who was involved in that, obviously, is Rachel Imenu, and I always find it interesting, Rachel Imenu, the mother of Yosef, and I always find it interesting that the Ramchal, that's his acronym of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lutzatoi, is the same letters as May Rachel, from Rachel. Okay, thank you. Any questions? No questions?
The Oizen is connected 3 spheres?
The what?
The nose.
The nose is connected 1. So you have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Wait, the eyes, 2 eyes. Yeah. It's interesting that the head represents its own 10 spheres. But what is so beautiful is that the tongue and the mouth represent Yesod Malchus. That's incredible. The Ramchal says this. I remember when I first saw that, it was incredible. Man, it says it like kalachiyad, like big deal. To him it was nothing. But it answers so many questions. Why Lashon Hara is so bad? Because it exacerbates the blockage from Yesoid, which is the 9th, that has to pour into the 10th, or else there's no reality, because that's what makes reality, and so on,
Isn't Malchus the totality of the system?
Yes, but that's only if it gets the Shefa, the ore of Yesoid. Yesoid must pour into Malchus.
So why is it a specific organ?
What?
Why is Malchus a specific organ if it's...
Every sphere has a specific organ.
But Malchus itself is usually, it's usually the whole system as a whole.
Yeah, so it takes the, what's called the Shefa of Yesoid, right? It takes that and it forms whatever it has to form into Malchus. So it's not its own ore, it's the ore of Yesoid, but the shape, the tzura, is the tzura of Malchus. Whereas the chomer, the substance, is the chomer of Yesoid. You see. Any questions?
Is there like a microcosm kind of concept with when you're explaining about cancer?
Yeah.
Because it looks like there's a unity among the Jewish people. Like if we conform with each other, if we have like unity and nobody's, like all on its own.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same.
The Jewish people are really one organism, right? Yeah.
Does it get corrected for a woman when she goes into, when she's past that age? Because a woman's cycle will stop when she's older. Was that tikkun accomplished?
Well,
have like that lifetime?
Yeah, look, it's only when she's giving birth, she has to experience death. But if she's not giving birth, why does she have to experience death? See? Death must follow the possibility of life, or else what's the point? You see? Because if you think about it, the whole concept of menstruation makes no sense. Why? Why does the uterus have to die? I mean, it doesn't die, its lining dies. Why? It doesn't make any sense. But that's the einish, that's the expression of the sin of what she did. You see, And by the way, the gematria of Nida is Zohama. The numerical value of Nida is Zohama. It's interesting. Great, okay. Thank you for coming.